Members of the Board of Trustees, Committee on Fiscal Affairs, please respond present when you hear your name. Chairperson Ferrer.
Here.
Vice Chairperson Mojica. We heard somebody sign in. We can come back for him. Trustee Sunshine.
Here.
Trustee Berger.
Here.
Trustee Cortez Vasquez. Trustee Thompson.
Here.
Trustee Schwartz. Professor Verzani.
Here.
Professor Benton.
Here.
Razia Arabi.
Here.
Kaysen Mamdin. Trustee Hunter. Trustee Burke.
Here.
Great. There's a COPS liaison, President Carol Mason. Okay, you have a quorum. Freddie?
Yes, thank you. We have a quorum. This public meeting of the Committee on Fiscal Affairs is called to order. On March 7, 2020, Governor Cuomo issued Executive Order 202 declaring a state of emergency in response to the COVID-19 outbreak. On March 13, 2020, Governor Cuomo issued Executive Order 202.1, which included the suspension of the law allowing the attendance of meetings telephonically or by other similar service. Article 7 of the Public Officers Law, to the extent necessary to permit any public body to meet and take such actions authorized by law without permitting in-person access to meetings and authorizing such meetings to be held remotely by conference call or similar service, provided that the public has the ability to view or listen to such proceeding and that such meetings are recorded and later transcribed. In accordance with the executive order, this board meeting is being held via teleconference with a live stream found at the CUNY Board of Trustees website. A copy of the agenda and the calendar is also available online at the CUNY Board of Trustees website. Additional items may be added during the meeting. As a reminder, please mute your audio so that we can ensure that everyone can hear. Now I'd like to ask the Secretary to call the roll of attendance for members of the Chancellor's Office and other invited guests.
Okay, members of the Chancellery and other invited guests, please respond present when you hear your name. Chancellor Matos Rodriguez. General Counsel Derek Davis.
Present.
Executive Vice Chancellor and University Provost Jose Luis Cruz. Executive Vice Chancellor and Chief Operating Officer Hector Batista.
Present.
Senior Vice Chancellor Matthew Sapienza.
Present.
Christina Chiappa. Catherine Abata.
Present.
And Martin Sturla.
Present.
Great. And did somebody else join, another from trustees, Trustee Mojica or Schwartz or Cortez Vasquez? Okay.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Let's now turn to the items requiring a vote today. Given that all board members are participating remotely, I'll announce the resolutions and ask for members to respond only if you would like to abstain or oppose an item. Otherwise, your vote will be recorded as a yes vote. If you are voting no or abstaining, please state your name and vote. Additionally, if you wish to second an item or have any questions, please state your name first for the record, and let's try to avoid speaking over one another. Let's take up the following item for approval. Action item 1A is approval of the minutes of the June 9, 2020 meeting. I'll move the approval of action item 1A. Do I have a second?
Berger, second.
Is there any discussion, changes to this? Anything?
No.
So we'll now vote. Please only respond if you would like to abstain or oppose. Hearing none, the meeting minutes of June 9th are approved. Now to the policy calendar, addressing Section B. Policy items 1B1 is a resolution requesting the authorization of a contract with W.W. Granger Incorporated to provide maintenance, repair, and operation supplies. The university is a member of the Education and Institution Cooperative Services Incorporated, a purchasing consortium, and pursuant to resolutions of the Board of Trustees adopted October 29, 2018 and March 30, 2020, the university has purchased maintenance, repair, and operating supplies from Granger under a contract offered through this consortium. The university has realized material savings through the existing contract in comparison to purchases from a New York State Office of General Services contract with Granger. The existing consortium contract with Granger is set to expire December 31, 2020, and the consortium has put in place a new agreement with Granger to replace the existing contract that's similarly available for use by members. The university has determined that a new consortium contract continues to offer more advantageous pricing. The university is now seeking approval for a new contract with Granger through December 31, 2024, with the option to renew for an additional 5-year term for an annual estimated spend of $5 million. Interim University Executive Director of Strategic Sourcing and Chief Procurement Officer, making his maiden voyage at this committee meeting. Martin Sturda will be available to provide further background on this item if required. In the meantime, I will move approval of item 1B1. Do I have a second?
Berger, second.
Is there any discussion on this or any question for our new Chief Procurement Officer on this item? Hearing none, we'll now vote. Please only respond if you would like to abstain or oppose. Item 1B1 is approved. Thank you. Now for information items, which do not require a vote. I'd like to address Section 2. Section 2A is the Administrative Guidance Single Bid Response Procedures. I'd like to ask the aforementioned Chief Procurement Officer, Mr. Sterling, for further information on this item.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Ferrer. My name is Martin Sturla, Interim Chief Procurement Officer, and I understand there was a concern raised during the last meeting of this committee in regard to single response bid. So my office addressed the concern and defined a procedure to provide guidance for these instances. It's essentially 5 factors to be considered. Number one, that a sufficient number of potential bidders were given a reasonable opportunity to submit their proposals. Secondly, the specifications or the scope of work didn't prevent other bidders from submitting a response. In other words, the requirements were not unnecessarily complex or prescriptive. The third is inquiries to other potential responders are documented, especially the reasons why they choose or choose not to submit a proposal. The fourth is the prices to be paid are deemed fair and reasonable. And last, that the resolicitation is not in the best interest of an opportunity.
Are there any comments on this or questions?
May I ask a question, please?
Trustee Berger?
Yeah. Is there a reason that this policy does not cover the auxiliary enterprises or the college foundations? Is it a matter of jurisdiction, or is there a policy reason for it?
Mr. Sturla?
Yes. I'll defer to VC Sapienza to complement my answer. I'm not aware of anything preventing this, from making valid for the other entities. VC Sapienza, do you have any other comments on this?
Yeah, no, thanks, Martin. Yeah, and thanks for the question, Trustee Berger. In terms of, auxiliaries, enterprises, and associations, we do have separate guidelines, but I think you raise a good point that on procurement guidelines that we have for them, which are separate, that we can incorporate these single bid guidelines into those. So yeah, we'll take a look at the auxiliary and association guidelines and add that language in, because I think you raise a good point. They should be subject to the same steps that the colleges have to go through for tax levy purchases.
Thank you.
Is that satisfactory, Trustee Berger?
Yes, it is.
Okay, is there anyone else?
I have a quick question. It's Professor Verzani.
Professor Verzani.
Many of these items are subject to sort of interpretation, and I'm curious how the person doing the purchase and the person doing the interpretation are distinct. It seems like it's the same individual, and that would lead to potential conflicts of interest.
This is Martin Sturl again. That's a good question. There's always an element of interpretation, and from a buyer's side, what we're trying to do with these guidelines is try to eliminate subjectivity and document the steps that we're taking, and make a informed decision as to, as I said, for example, that the requirements are not unrealistic or unnecessary, and we have made reasonable efforts to reach out to additional suppliers. And so it's ultimately down to the buyer's, discretion, and of course, with my approval to decide, if all the steps were taken before making a final decision. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'm still concerned about the potential, but I understand it'd be more advantageous if there were some impartial group that observed this, or some ombudsman of some sort, but I don't know that title or role exists within your structure, so maybe I'm wishing for things that aren't possible.
Well, if I'm sorry, if this is Martin Sturl again, we train the people, we provide training to the people at the campuses, and so if they make such a decision, it requires central office approval and oversight. So to some extent, or to that extent, there's some cross examination of these purchases. They're still within, the procurement function, but from different, from the campuses and central office.
Okay. Thank you.
Is there anyone else? Well, I have a couple of observations with respect to, in fact, that come right on Professor Verzani's observation. I want to remind the committee that this change in the administrative guidance on single bid responses comes after a very lively discussion publicly and privately with respect to an elevator bid. Anybody recall that?
Absolutely.
We had one bid, and the reason for that was because, among other things, but the principal reason was it was a proprietary technology that nobody else decided to bid on. For the record, I am skeptical of those things. I think those are excuses, not by our people, but by the industry in particular. So I think this new procedure is a step forward. However, I think would be useful for the committee and the Board of Trustees to know exactly who is making these representations on behalf of the college and or central office, that we absolutely cannot do without this bidder, and why, exactly why, and that information be included with any such bid response presented to the trustees and to this committee. Look, we all live in the real world, and sometimes these things happen, but they shouldn't happen with annoying regularity. The justification of proprietary technology is one such example. Look, my own belief is that until a public agency has shown its readiness to default the bid and say, this is a failed bid, we're going to bid this again until we get some competition, that's not going to really change anything in any of these industries, including the elevator industry. But this is a good start, and I commend the administration for it, but I would like to see two things as these are presented to the committee and to trustees. One, what these specific exceptions are that are being made, and two, what efforts are being made to get more competitive bids. Or else we'll continue to see these things and consider these things and throw up our hands and say, well, we did the best we could, when really that's not the best we can do. May I have a response from... Yes?
Sorry, this is Martin Sewell. I just want to say that I think it's a fair ask, and I commit to include this within these guidelines and come up with a plan that addresses that as well, to make it a solid case if we have to go that route. And the other thing that I want to mention, Mr. Chairman, is we're going to ask DASNY for new construction, so to avoid putting ourselves in a box with these cases of proprietary software. There may be cases in which we did it to ourselves. So this is a conversation that it's pending with DASNY, and so we'll make sure that to the extent possible we avoid boxing ourselves in these kind of situations. Thank you. That is
very useful, and certainly look forward to seeing any progress on that. Is there anybody else? Okay. Are we done on 2A? Ready to go to item 2B? Then I'd like to call on our CFO, Matt Sapienza, for further information on the 2020 year-end financial report.
Thank you, Mr.
Matt?
Chairman. Hello again, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the fiscal year 2020 preliminary year-end report is part of your materials that we sent out on Friday in the part of the packet on information items. It's considered a preliminary report because technically we close out our fiscal year by September 30th with both the state and the city. And we produced this report a few days before September 30th. So there are some numbers that could change, but the fact that there are only a few days left in closing out the fiscal year, they should not change materially. And I just want to recognize our budget director, Kathy Abad, and her team in the University Budget Office for their terrific work in putting this report together. So there's an executive summary on page 2 of the report, but I'm not going to go through that. You can read that if you haven't already, and I'll talk more about the high-level patterns that we're seeing and how that sets us up for the current fiscal year that we're in. And then happy to take any questions at the end. So fiscal year 20 certainly was a challenging year, especially the last quarter of the fiscal year with COVID hitting us so hard here in New York City and in New York State. But we did have a slight improvement in our overall condition from the third quarter report, which we were pleased to see. Although our projected revenues went down from where we thought they were going to be in the third quarter report, again, mainly due to COVID, our expenditures also went down. Projected expenditures also went down, again, due to COVID. We went to remote learning about halfway through the semester, and with the campuses being not having the level of activity that they normally had, the level of our expenditures went down. So overall, our senior colleges and graduate professional schools, and a summary of every college's final year-end number is on page 3. But our senior colleges and graduate professional schools are ending up with year-end reserves, again, rolled from the previous year and offset by any revenue and expenditure changes for this year, with reserves of $32.4 million. Now, last year, the senior colleges and graduate professional schools ended with $35 million in reserves. So there was a slight decline, but pretty much in the same ballpark, going from 35 to 32.4. The community colleges, however, we had a pretty significant decline in reserves. In fiscal 19, the community colleges ended with $20 million in reserves, and this year with only $6 million in reserves. And so there is a concern there, which I want to talk about in just a minute. But I also want to point out that there were 2 colleges that ended the year in deficit, which were the 2 colleges that we were projecting in the third quarter report, which was one senior college, Medgar College, and one community college, Kingsborough Community College. Medgar ended with a deficit of about $3 million, Kingsborough with about $5 million. And I'm going to talk about these 2 colleges in more detail at the end of my presentation, but I want to walk through some of the more high-level patterns and data elements university-wide, and we'll say Medgar, Everest, and Kingsborough to the end. So on the community colleges, I just want to unpack that significant decline that we saw in reserves in community colleges a little bit more. So 2 main reasons why this happens. One is in the last quarter of the fiscal year, the city of New York allocated a $20 million reduction to us, again, as a result of COVID. Now, a $20 million reduction in any one year is a significant reduction to try to manage, but to try to manage it in the last quarter of the fiscal year was a really, really significant challenge. And so that was one reason why community colleges needed to dip into their reserves in order to help manage that. But the second main reason was that community college enrollment levels were down 6% last year. And again, this is a pattern that has been happening the last several years and is a nationwide trend in terms of community college enrollment. We had a tuition freeze at the community colleges this past fiscal year, and we've had one for 4 years in a row. So with enrollment levels being down 6% and having a tuition freeze, that resulted in a revenue loss for the community colleges year to year of $27 million. So we had a $27 million revenue loss. Last quarter of the year, we had a $20 million city funding loss. And so those things contributed to the significant use of reserves for community colleges this past year. Senior colleges, again, it was about $2.5 million of a $35 million base that was used for reserves. And again, every college is different. Some colleges increased their reserves. Some colleges used more of them than we would like to see. But overall, it was only $2.5 million. And again, senior college enrollment, unlike the community colleges, was flat from year to year, kind of stayed the same. And we did increase tuition at the community colleges this past year effective in fall 2019, $200 increase. And so that generated an additional $24 million net year to year in tuition revenue increases. And so that helped the senior colleges again. So overall, I want to talk a little bit about revenue, stay on this topic of revenues and spending. So overall spending for personal services, which are payroll costs, year to year from fiscal 19 to fiscal 20 went up by 7%. OTPS, other than personal services, our purchasing budget, went down by 12%, more so at the community colleges than at the senior colleges, again, due to the factors that I mentioned for the community colleges. But the personal service expenditures going up by 7% was all due to our new collective bargaining increases with our faculty union and with our administrative unions as well, DC 37, and the other administrative unions. Our total positions, our total full-time staffing, from the beginning of fiscal 19 to the close of fiscal 20, we've gone down by 247 positions university-wide. And that number has continued to come down. As the trustees are aware, the chancellor did announce a hiring freeze in late April. And since then, we have lost several hundred more positions. And so we are down pretty significantly in our staffing. But even though we're down in our staffing, because of the collective bargaining increases, our overall payroll expenses went up by about 7%. Again, purchasing is down around 12%, and again, that's due to some of the challenges I mentioned earlier. Enrollment, you can see on page 20 the numbers that we talked about in terms of the community colleges decline and the senior colleges staying stable. And you can see the year-to-year expenditure changes on page 19. Starting on page 32, there are summary dashboards for each college that there's a page for each college that shows what their expenditures are, revenues, enrollment, staffing, gives details on all these things as prior year comparisons on all of those components. And so I want to talk, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit more about Medgar Evers College and Kingsborough Community College. And we're working very closely with these two colleges and have been throughout the whole fiscal year. Their controllable spending is coming down, and really the deficits at both colleges are really the main driver here are the enrollments. At Medgar Evers College, the enrollments went down by 13% over the previous year, and at Kingsborough by 6%. When you look at the controllable spend, meaning things that, not including collective bargaining increases, but at Medgar Evers, their spending on adjuncts went down by 1%. Their spending on temporary services went down by 6%. Their total positions are down 8%, by 45 positions, again, since the beginning of fiscal 19. So they are trying to manage their staffing. They are trying to manage some of their controllable expenses. But again, the revenues coming down, the enrollments coming down so significantly by 13%. They just, despite the actions that they took, they just weren't able to get there in terms of ending the year in a surplus. So they were down about $3 million. Kingsborough, very similar. Their staffing was down as well by 38 positions, which was about 4%. Their temporary services costs went down by 12%. Their OTPS went down by 17%. So again, they were trying to control their spending, but again, the enrollment decline had them fall short of their revenue target by $4.2 million, which essentially drove the entire deficit that they had of about $5. Last year, interestingly, in fiscal 19, even though Kingsborough had enrollment decreased for the last several years, they did meet their revenue target in fiscal 19, but in fiscal 20, they fell short by about $4.2 million. So, again, those two colleges we did project in the third quarter would have a deficit, and they did end in a deficit at year end. So, overall, we ended the year a little bit better than we thought in the third quarter report. And I would say that overall, we do have concerns with some of our colleges that ended the year, like Medgar and Kingsborough, with no reserves. Some of our colleges are ending with very little reserves, and that's a concern as we're heading into, and we certainly are currently in, and we'll be heading into a fiscal downturn for the next couple of years. And so that's something that we're going to monitor very closely and continue to work with those colleges very closely. And again, some of the actions that we've already taken will help us in terms of managing this year's budget. As I mentioned, the Chancellor announced a hiring freeze, and some of the other personnel actions that we've taken, and some of the other freezes that we've had on things like travel and on purchasing will help us manage the continuing challenges that we'll have in the fiscal year. So, I went through a lot, so I'll stop here, and happy to take any questions or concerns that the committee might have.
Any questions from the committee?
Mr. Chairman, if I may.
Please, Mr. Berger.
Matt, do any of the federal COVID funds show up in the fiscal 20 financial report?
It's a good question, Trustee Berger. I appreciate you raising that. No, none of the funds that we will be eligible for are reflected here in fiscal 20. However, those will help the colleges in terms of these year-end balances that are depicted on page 3. So, for instance, colleges in the last quarter of the fiscal year incurred liabilities as a result of COVID, which will be reimbursed through funds that they got through the CARES Act and also through FEMA. And so when those funds are allocated to the colleges, they will reimburse themselves, and that will help improve some of their bottom line. So it'll help them in 21, help them manage their challenges for 21. But because we haven't drawn down any of those funds, or in the case of FEMA, haven't received any of those funds, we didn't reflect them here in the fiscal 20 report. But as those funds start to flow and as we allocate them to the colleges, we'll reflect them in our quarterly reporting for fiscal 21.
And on page 11, are state TAP funds reflected under state city appropriations or under tuition revenue?
This is Kathy Abada. It's under tuition revenue.
It's under tuition revenue, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this may not be your wheelhouse, but do we have a sense now that we're into October what our fall 20 enrollments are as compared to last year?
Yeah. Our enrollments overall, university-wide, are down a little bit more than 4%. And so why, we obviously would like to see enrollment up. Being down 4%, when you think back to where we were back in the spring, and many colleges and university systems were concerned about a major drop-off, I think, landing at 4% was something that, we're somewhat satisfied with. And I want to just talk about, if I could take a minute to talk about just the different sectors, because we did have some positive outcomes in our enrollment. First of all, applications from year to year were up, which is always good. Senior colleges are actually up a little bit overall, about 1%, which is, again, really good, and especially in this environment. Senior colleges are up 1%. And in our graduate programs, were up almost 3%. So again, that's I think going to be helpful to our senior colleges that have master and doctoral programs because those enrollments are up. So that's all good. Really where we're seeing the decline, and again, college by college is different. There are some senior colleges that are down, but it's the community colleges again that we're seeing the overall enrollment decline. So community colleges are down again. A couple of our schools that are on different calendars, Kingsborough and LaGuardia, their semester started a little later, so there may be some catch up there. But again, this is something that, and there were some reports that were issued late last week that described that, again, this nationwide impact that COVID has had on community college enrollments. And again, the state control of the report, which I thought was so interesting, that talked about how COVID has significantly impacted jobs in the restaurant industry, in the retail industry. 41% of the jobs that were lost in New York State were those type of service industries. And those are the industries that our students work in, and that community college students work in. And so the fact that an overwhelming majority of people in those industries have lost their jobs, we think has a direct impact on what community college enrollment, the result was for this semester. Historically, if you go back 30 years when the unemployment rate is high, community college enrollment is usually high. That didn't turn out in this semester. It hasn't happened statewide, for the SUNY community colleges are down. And again, nationwide community college enrollment is down. So that's really the area that we need to continue to focus on, continue to work with our community colleges on to try to improve.
And the amount on page 3 shown due from TAP, is there any concern that the state will withhold that money?
And that represents the amount, and the state has been temporarily withholding 20% of payments. And so the last TAP payment for fiscal 20, we received 80%, and the state is temporarily withholding 20%. But all of our discussions that we've had with State Higher Ed Services Corp. And other folks in the state, they have assured us that those funds will be eventually deposited with CUNY.
Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Can I add something? This is Fellow.
Sure.
Thank you. Just a couple of thoughts on overall, adding to what Matt said. One of the things also that we've been working, particularly with the community college sector, in response to having a much more updated set of course offerings and programs, is taking a look at our applied associate's degree, which should be the sector that is much more immediately in tune with industry. And we did some surveying of those degrees system-wide last year, and I'm happy to sort of also provide the board with a presentation of those at the appropriate time. And we're working very closely with the community college presidents to revamp programs that might not be as relevant to industry anymore, create some new programs and short-term programs, because we think, first, that's the right thing to do overall, but also because we think that will be a response to the ongoing decline in the enrollment side that we've seen in the community colleges for the past couple of years. Our work with the New York City Job CEO Council that was announced a few months ago, that led by Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan Chase and others. The first group of programmatic investments that are going to be done are going to be probably in a number of the degrees that are offered in the community colleges, and to, again, continue to either create new programs, get rid of programs that really have no pipeline to work for the students, have been underperforming, invest in those that have. So we're also hoping that entire area of work will be very, very helpful in terms of the of future enrollment growth for the community colleges. So I just wanted to put that there as, one of the things that we're doing with that sector to address that slide in enrollment. The other element, Matt, that I'm not sure here, I forgot to ask you, but we did, even though the full enrollment numbers, as Matt mentioned, were not, I think they were better than we had anticipated, right? But still in decline, and in decline in some of the sectors that have been hurting the most. There should be a little uptick. I don't know when it gets reported. Part of the growth in summer enrollment, right, Matt, gets reported in the first quarter of 21.
Most of the summer enrollment would hit fiscal 20. Summer is always split between 20 and 21, depending on when it comes in terms of the fiscal year. But the bulk of it was in fiscal 20.
Okay.
Yeah, and as the chancellor mentioned, we had a significant increase in summer enrollment this past summer. I think it was up 15% or something like that. So that, again, helped the colleges in terms of managing their revenues and managing their budget for this fiscal year, and will help in fiscal 21 as well.
I think it's edifying to see that we've avoided the fate of a number of other colleges and university systems, and our enrollment has either remained stable or ticked up slightly. That's a wonderful thing, and a great tribute to our management of the institution. If there's nothing else on that, I have...
Can I raise the question? Sorry. This is Professor Verzani.
Yeah. Sure, I had a question.
I'm sorry.
I had a question. I was just going to ask a question.
Okay, I thought you were going to cut off questions. I can certainly wait. I'm sorry. I misread it.
No, I was just going to ask a question. And it'll be brief. We were just talking about Medgar and Kingsborough, and those have been issues throughout. I recognize that the administration has taken aggressive steps to control costs there, and it's difficult to separate the issues here. Maybe you could help us out very briefly. I'd like to know what the impact it has been of those cuts in costs at Medgar and Kingsborough, and then what was the secondary impact of drops of enrollment. I think it would be useful to understand those as two separate events.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, on the first point, certainly when a college has a one-year sudden drop in enrollment that doesn't seem to be a pattern, then that can have a significant disturbance in spending and managing a budget. But in other cases, and I'll pick Kingsborough because I think that's something that been a one-year phenomenon, and over the last several years, Kingsborough's enrollment has been coming down for each of the last several years. It wasn't an aberration in fiscal 20 that they had an enrollment loss. So certainly when you have less students than you had 4 years ago, then one would expect that your staffing levels, whether it's administrative or instructional or adjuncts, they should come down. If you're serving less students, you should have less staff, and so that should be a result in that. I mean, certainly you still need a president, you still need a bursar, you still need a provost, you still need all those positions, but should have less staff. And so it is, I think, good fiscal management that, Kingsborough is moving in that direction. Medgar Evers, in terms of enrollment, several years ago, they were having some nice enrollment increases, I should say. In the last couple of years, that's reversed and has come down. And so, the staffing decreases really just started for Medgar in this past year, in fiscal 20. Again, I think that was good fiscal management to do that with enrollment coming down. And, for those two colleges, we'll have to continue to monitor their enrollment and, as the chancellor said, see where there's opportunities to try to either bring in more students. But if that's not the case, if the enrollment level they're at now is where they are going to be for the next several years, then that's part of what we want to work with them on, is to say, what is the right staffing level now for the school that's at this enrollment level rather than where you were 3 or 4 years ago. And so that's one of the key elements that we're working with them on, and we'll continue to work with them on. And one other thing I just want to point out about Medgar Evers and Kingsborough that is challenging for those two colleges in comparison to some of our other colleges, and why an enrollment decrease at those colleges is more acute, is that some of our, especially senior colleges, some of our older colleges that have been around for a long time and have a bigger alumni base because they've been around, since the 1930s, or go back City College since the 1800s. Some of those colleges, or I should say many of those colleges, have the ability to raise private funds that Medgar Evers and Kingsborough have not, because they're newer schools and they don't have, the large alumni bases that some of the senior colleges do. So, in looking at, all of our colleges in the CUNY system and comparing them and say this one ended with a reserve and this one did not, or this one had a deficit, that has to be taken into account too. How much they're generating from private fundraising, how much they're generating from federal and state grants that are generating some resources as well. And so, all those things have to be taken into consideration too when evaluating and comparing, some of our more senior colleges to some of our community colleges and some of our comprehensive colleges like Medgar.
Thank you. I was hoping for something a bit more specific, but we can pursue this offline. I don't want to take the committee's time, if that's okay with you. Professor Bazzani?
Mr. Chair?
Yes. Professor Bazzani, did you want to?
I'm certainly, as someone had spoken up, I didn't know if you were going to. Okay,
no, I'll go after that. I'll go after his question.
Okay, thank you. You can
I'm
go
sorry,
first,
I didn't.
Please go ahead, Chancellor.
I mean, one of the things, and we can, maybe do a deeper dive in those two schools as Trustee Ferrer has mentioned. But clearly, one of the things in the case of Medgar, since we have, we're in the process of hiring, looking for a new president. There's a transition in the presidency there. And actually, one of the things for me in looking at the next candidate will be, I think that, one of the elements that one could argue when we look at the footprint of our schools, and it's sort of somewhat connected to what Matt had mentioned. We have, and Manhattan as a borough, I think, sort of plays out a little bit different in terms of the number of students that come in from outside Manhattan to our Manhattan-based schools, right? But when you think about the portfolio of the colleges that we have in the outer boroughs, right? Medgar as a senior college has a lot more competition if you just look at the CUNY universe from both New York City Tech and Brooklyn College, right? In ways that Queens, for example, has only 2 senior colleges, and so I clearly part of the the challenge, right, and the task for the new leadership there will be to think about what is it that needs for Medgar Evers and for the central office to be helpful in helping to identify that need and create a space, because one could argue that it's a big crowded, more crowded space, so again, those are some of the considerations that as we have the opportunity with the search at Medgar that are very much in my mind, and I think connected to some of the long-term corrections to some of the fiscal challenges at Medgar. I just wanted to put that on the table.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Chancellor. Professor Barzani?
Yeah,
the coast is clear.
If you don't mind a little speculation, I see this upcoming fiscal year as an issue for the community colleges. I heard there's a 7% increase in PS costs. I would anticipate that's going to be about the same unless there's significant staffing reductions. I know that overall enrollment, I think, at the community college is off somewhere around 8%. Save for Gutman, I think they're all down significantly. And there's no tuition increase, although that had been planned to sort of rescue it the way the senior college was rescued by those resources. And the last year, there was a nearly $14 million decline in reserves, leaving just $6 million, I think you mentioned, Matt. So when I put that all together and I play it forward this next year, it seems like we're going to be bailing out all the community colleges as a system because I don't think the reserves will hold. Is there concern about that, or am I just sort of scaremongering here?
No, well, there is concern about the community colleges. And just on one quick point, Professor Barzani, that the 7% increase in personal services expenses that we saw from 19 to 20, we don't expect to, again, see from 20 to 21 because that 7% does include retroactive costs of the collective bargaining agreement that were paid in fiscal 20. So while there are scheduled collective bargaining increases for fiscal 21, we won't have the retroactive costs, and so the numbers should be smaller. And with the effects of the hiring freeze, the total staffing, as I said, is continuing to come down, and that should offset some of the contractual increases. But to your more general point about the community college budgets, yes, we have concerns. The city adopted budget had a $46 million reduction for the university, which the majority of which is going to come out of the community college budgets. Because our enrollment is going down, even if our state aid number, the amount that the state currently pays per student, which is $2,947, even if that stays the same, we're going to get less state aid just because we have less students. So that's a concern too. And again, the enrollment going down is going to generate less tuition revenue. So definitely concerns on the community colleges, but we're working closely with all of them. And again, we call on, as I know, our local elected leaders and our chancellor and our board have called on the federal government to provide some more support for state and local governments. That's a real key and something that we continue to advocate for.
Thank you.
Okay. If there's nothing else, I'd like to turn to item 2C, the Fiscal Matters Information Report. And again, our CFO, Matt Sapienza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Fiscal Matters Information Report is a report that we include as an information item for every meeting. And for this month's meeting, the items that we receive from the colleges, receive from two colleges, and they're covering tuition waivers at the School of Labor and Urban Studies and at Lehman College. And for Lehman College, they're related to grants that they received, whereby the grants that they've gotten from the U.S. Department of Ed are offsetting the costs of the instructional service, and so tuition is being waived, something that is fairly common in higher ed. Lehman also has an item that they're waiving tuition for participants in a program who are union members of Local 1199. And that's very similar to the tuition waivers that you see listed in the report from the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And the nature of the School of Labor and Urban Studies is they have deep connections with the unions here in New York. And so we're very fortunate that our union partners send a lot of their members to courses that are offered by the School of Labor and Urban Studies. And so for those, we're waiving the residency requirement on tuition. And so if someone's a union member of, let's say, taking, for example, one of the items on here, the Communication Workers of America, whether they live in New Jersey or Connecticut or Pennsylvania, they pay the in-state rate. And these are individual courses. They're not, being waived for a whole degree granting program. But again, something that is fairly common. It's something that the School of Labor and Urban Studies, even when they were the Joseph Murphy Institute before they were school, were doing as part of their partnerships with the unions. And so that's what this month's report is covering, the waivers that have been granted by those two colleges.
Is there anyone on this information item? Well, with no more items on the agenda, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Seconded.
All in favor? This meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.